As I passed through the security checkpoint at the airport, a sudden unease gripped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to unfold differently than usual. I had grown accustomed to the watchful eyes of security personnel, but today was different. A white police officer stood by the check-in counter, his eyes lingering on me longer than they had on anyone else. It was a look I recognized well, a gaze of judgment, of suspicion, as though I was a puzzle he needed to solve, a threat he hadn't quite figured out. The tension in the air seemed palpable, and I knew, deep down, that this was more than just an ordinary encounter. But there was one crucial detail the officer was missing. I wasn't just another passenger in this sea of travelers. I was the owner of the very airline he was tasked with policing. I could almost hear the ironic hum of the universe, the setup that would lead to a confrontation I had not anticipated. Every time I passed through airport security, it felt like I was under a magnifying glass. Every step, every glance, every movement scrutinized, as if I were guilty of something I couldn't even comprehend. Today was no exception. As I passed through, I could feel the officer's gaze searing into my back. It was uncomfortable, but it was not new. What unnerved me, however, was the intensity of his stare, the way he seemed to be sizing me up, making assumptions. His eyes tracked my every movement, never wavering. I could feel his eyes on me, like a predator to its prey. It was almost suffocating, and the air between us thickened with unspoken tension. Despite this growing discomfort, I remained calm. Years of experience had taught me how to weather such moments. But there was something different today. An unsettling premonition whispered in the back of my mind. I felt the unmistakable stirrings of an impending storm. This was not going to be a routine trip to Chicago. My heart beat faster, but I didn't let it show. A voice inside me told me that the officer wouldn't back down, that his judgments were already made, and he was on a mission to put me in my place. He didn't know who I was, but soon he would. As expected, the officer began walking toward me. His movements were calculated, steady, his eyes still locked on mine. He was closing the distance, making his intentions clear. His expression was a mask of professionalism, but the intent was there. He was determined to make his move. "Let me see your documents," he said, his tone authoritative, his eyes never leaving mine. I handed him my passport and ticket, my hand steady, my outward composure unshaken. The surrounding crowd was now watching, sensing that something was happening. But I didn't flinch. I knew what was coming, and I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. He scrutinized my documents for what felt like an eternity, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Where are you flying?" he asked, not bothering to look up. "To Chicago," I replied, my tone flat, suppressing the frustration threatening to bubble to the surface. "For what purpose?" He pressed on, his voice growing colder, more demanding. "A business trip," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough calm to keep him in check. He closed my passport with deliberation, his fingers lingering on the edge as though weighing his next move. There was a moment of silence, and then, without warning, he grabbed my arm, his grip firm, almost rough, and began leading me toward the police car parked nearby. It was a turning point. The moment I realized that, for all his authority, this officer had made a crucial mistake. I could have resisted, could have made a scene, but I didn't. I knew that pushing back would only escalate things. Instead, I stayed calm, letting the situation unfold, knowing that the officer was about to learn a harsh lesson. As we neared the police car, I sat in the back seat, my mind already calculating the steps to follow. The officer, confident in his control, slid into the driver's seat, his face still cold, as though this was a routine matter. But as the car engine roared to life, I leaned forward, catching his gaze in the rearview mirror. "Do you want to know who I am?" I asked, my voice steady. He smirked, dismissing me as just another person trying to talk their way out of trouble. "Sure," he replied, sarcasm dripping from his tone. "I am the owner of this airline," I said calmly. In that split second, his smirk vanished. His face froze, and I saw the shock in his eyes. He wasn't sure if he had heard me right. But in that moment, I knew. His world was crumbling. His arrogance, his assumptions, everything he thought he knew was about to be shattered. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. A heavy silence filled the car. The tension was unbearable, and I could feel his unease growing with every passing second. He tried to recover, but I could tell his confidence was waning. He was beginning to understand the mistake he had made. We drove on in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. The officer had underestimated me, and now his prejudice was turning against him. When we arrived at the police station, he was still trying to maintain control, but I could see it in his eyes. He was terrified of what was coming. Inside the station, I was led to a small room, and as I sat down, I noticed the officers around me casting suspicious glances. They, too, had made up their minds about who I was. They assumed I was just another troublemaker, someone they could push around, but they had no idea I wasn't the person they thought I was. Time passed slowly, and the officer who had detained me was now avoiding my gaze, his nerves palpable. He fumbled with paperwork, casting nervous glances at the clock. I knew his mind was racing, trying to figure out how to salvage this mess. Finally, I broke the silence. "How much longer?" I asked, my voice cool, collected. The officer didn't respond at first. Then, his gaze flicked to mine, and I saw the panic in his eyes. It was a look of someone who knew they were caught, someone who was on the brink of losing everything. My lawyers were already on their way, and the officer knew it. The moment I said the words, his face drained of color. The realization hit him hard. His whole world was collapsing in real time, and he couldn't escape it. I let the silence drag on, watching as his confidence evaporated. I could feel the power shift in the room. For once, it wasn't him in control. It was me. As the minutes passed, the tension only grew. Then, the door opened. My lawyer entered, and the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The officer's face went pale, his bravado gone. "Can you explain why you detained my client?" my lawyer asked, his voice steady, confident. The officer stammered, trying to justify his actions. But his words fell flat, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He couldn't defend his actions. He had no excuse. The room was thick with tension as the truth sank in. The officer's career was on the line, and he knew it. My lawyer pressed on, asking the critical question, "Are you aware that my client is the owner of the airline he was trying to board?" The officer froze. His face drained of color, and he could no longer hide his fear. His hands trembled, and he looked everywhere but at me. His entire world had been built on assumptions and prejudice, and now it was crumbling. The police chief entered, and after a brief exchange, the officer was asked to remain behind for further investigation. I left with my lawyer, but I couldn't resist one last look at the officer. His head was bowed, and he sat there, defeated. The consequences of his actions were finally catching up with him. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't just about me. This was bigger than one man's mistake. It was about the system that had allowed this type of behavior to persist unchecked. But today, that system was facing its reckoning, and I was part of it.